We're going to be demonstrating how to lay out bed springs. You're going to need a drill, screwdriver, tape measure, pen and paper, and calculator. I'm using a chalk line to lay out my lines. You can also use a template. So let's get started. So to determine how many springs you're going to need for your bed, you're going to take the length and the width and you're going to divide each of them by 5.375 or 5 3/8. You're going to take those numbers, you're going to round them to the nearest whole number, you're going to multiply your two whole numbers together, and that's going to give you the amount of springs you're going to need for your bed. First thing we're going to do is we're going to measure the width. At 57 inches. And I'm going to write that down. By 75 inches. So I'm going to take 57 inches divided by 5.375 inches equals 10.6. Take that number and round to the nearest whole number, you get 11. That's the number of springs I'm going to need for the width of the bed. Now I'm going to take 75 inches. Take 75 inches divided by 5.375 equals 13.9. I'm going to round up to 14. That's how many springs I'm going to need for the length of the bed. I'm going to take this number, 11, take this number, 14, multiply 11 by 14 equals 154. I'm going to need 154 springs for the RV bed. All right, so when you're laying out your bed springs, the only thing that really matters is that the springs are evenly spaced and that the springs stay on your bed platform. So the ideal spacing of the bed springs is going to be 5 3/8 inches. You start at the center point, you measure out 5 3/8 inches from either side of the center, 5 3/8 inches, 5 3/8 inches, and so on until you get to the end of the bed. However, because different RV platforms are different widths and lengths, you may not be able to do that and not have the last spring hang off the end. So you're going to have to move it in. When you move it in, that's going to make this part of the bed more firm. The closer the springs are together, the firmer it is. So you're going to have to adjust your springs. And so it's not an exact science. Really, the most important thing is that they're somewhat evenly spaced and that they stay on the bed platform. So what we're going to do is we're going to do our best just to get these evenly spaced. If you want to get them closer together, you're more than welcome to. Like I said, the closer they are, the firmer the bed's going to be in that section. Also, when laying out your springs, you're going to want them all facing in the same direction. Notice the difference. If you alternate the direction of the springs, it's going to increase the firmness of the bed. All right, so because the width of our RV bed platform will not allow for spacing of 5 3/8 inch from center point to center point, we've had to readjust the springs in order to keep them evenly spaced and to stay on the platform. So now the measurement that we have is approximately 5 3/16 inches. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a line every 5 3/16 inch across the entire width of the bed. So now that we've determined the spacing for the springs across the width of the bed, we need to determine the spacing for the springs across the length of the bed. The calculations that we did determined that we need to use 14 springs to cover the length of the bed. Now, because there's an even amount of springs, you're not going to have one spring dead center. You're going to have 7 springs on either side of the center point. To determine where to start with your first spring, you need to remember that the ideal spacing is 5 3/8 inches. So we're going to measure half of that to determine where to mark for our first spring. Half of 5 3/8 inches is 2 11/16 inches. So we're going to measure out 2 11/16 inches, and then on either side of the center point. And from these 2 marks, we're going to measure 5 3/8 inches all the way down the length of the bed platform. I went ahead and already marked out 5 3/8 inches for the length of the platform to speed up the process. So as it turns out, the ideal 5 3/8 inch spacing for the bed springs works for the length of this bed. We went ahead and laid them out accordingly, and if it hadn't, then we would have had to adjust the springs in and adjust the spacing similar to what we did with the width of the bed. Again, the only important part is all the bed springs are on the bed platform and that they're evenly spaced. So now that we've got the grid laid out, we're going to go ahead and we're going to drill pilot holes at each of the intersections that we've laid out, with the exception of this length center line. We're not going to be using that one. That was just to use to determine where to space the bed springs. So now that we've got the pilot holes drilled out, we're going to lay out the springs. When you're laying out the springs, keep in mind there are 2 types of springs. There's a dark gray spring and a light gray spring. The dark gray spring is more firm. The light gray spring is less firm. We're going to lay out 3 rows of dark gray springs, then 2 rows of light gray springs where the shoulders are. Then we're going to continue on with the dark gray springs for the rest of the bed. If you don't want to use the light gray springs at the shoulder area, you can move them down to the foot of the bed where the firmness doesn't matter so much. Notice that all of the springs are oriented in the same direction. If you alternate the springs, it's going to increase the firmness of the bed.